In the early days of World War II, few aircraft drew as much ridicule as the P-47 Thunderbolt. When it first appeared, German pilots and even some Allied airmen couldn't help but laugh. The thing looked enormous, a bulky, barrel-shaped machine that seemed better suited to hauling cargo than fighting sleek, agile enemies in the sky. While the Luftwaffe had the streamlined Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the deadly Focke-Wulf 190, the Americans rolled out something that looked like a flying milk bottle. The press and pilots alike gave it nicknames that reflected more humor than respect, the Jug being the one that stuck. To many, this machine symbolized excess rather than excellence. When the P-47 lined up beside the elegant Spitfire or Mustang, it looked completely out of place. Its fuselage was massive, its nose dominated by a huge engine that gave it a blunt, unrefined look. It weighed almost twice as much as other fighters, and even on the ground, it seemed to lumber rather than glide. German pilots, confident in their faster and more maneuverable aircraft, mocked the idea that such a heavy beast could ever challenge them in combat. They joked that it could hardly take off, let alone climb or dogfight. And to many Allied observers, the laughter almost seemed justified. Early test flights were rough. The P-47 guzzled fuel, needed long runways, and demanded constant maintenance. It felt less like a nimble bird of prey and more like a mechanical brawler that hadn't yet found its rhythm. Yet behind those laughs was a subtle arrogance. The kind of arrogance that often blinds opponents before the real fight begins. The Americans weren't trying to build a graceful dogfighter. They were building something different. Something that could take punishment, hit hard, and keep flying when everything else fell apart. But in these early moments, no one saw that vision. All they saw was a heavy, slow machine that seemed destined for failure. German pilots scoffed as they watched reports of its trials, convinced that this strange, overbuilt fighter would never last in the brutal skies of Europe. They didn't know it yet, but the very shape they laughed at would soon become the shadow that haunted their airfields, and the roar they would come to fear. At the heart of the P-47 Thunderbolt's creation was a man who refused to accept the limits of conventional design, Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer who had fled war and revolution before finding refuge in America. Kartveli believed that survival and victory in the air didn't depend on elegance or tradition, but on raw power and endurance. In the late 1930s, as the world edged closer to war, he and his team at Republic Aviation were given a nearly impossible challenge: build a fighter that could outperform anything flying at the time, especially at high altitudes where battles would increasingly be fought. The result of that ambition was something entirely new, a machine built not around a pilot, but around an engine. That engine was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a massive air-cooled radial powerhouse capable of producing more than 2,000 horsepower. It was one of the most powerful piston engines ever built, but it came with a problem: it was enormous. To fit it, Kartveli had to design an equally large airframe, reinforced with thick armor and fuel tanks big enough to feed the beast. Every engineer in the hangar knew what that meant. The aircraft would be heavy, far heavier than any frontline fighter that had come before it. But Kartveli didn't see weight as a weakness. He saw it as protection. If the P-47 was going to fly into the most dangerous skies on Earth, it needed to be able to take hits and come home. The result was a design philosophy that went against everything the world had seen in air combat. While European fighters like the Spitfire and Messerschmitt were small, agile, and elegant, the Thunderbolt was brute strength given wings. It was a tank that could fly, a thick-skinned, heavily armed fortress that traded graceful turns for brute survivability. Engineers at Republic Aviation built it with ruggedness in mind: self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating around the cockpit, and control systems that could keep functioning even after taking enemy fire. The plane wasn't meant to dance through the sky. It was meant to dominate it through endurance and overwhelming firepower. But when the prototype first rolled out, skepticism filled the air. Test pilots found it difficult to handle, and even Republic's own engineers wondered if it could ever be refined enough for combat. It took up too much space, it burned too much fuel, and it looked too slow to survive against the Luftwaffe's razor-sharp fighters. Some in the U.S. Army Air Corps questioned whether the entire program was worth continuing. But Kartveli and his team pushed forward, refining systems, improving the turbocharger, and testing the plane's high-altitude performance again and again. Slowly, the Thunderbolt began to prove that appearances could deceive. At heights where most fighters struggled for power, the P-47's massive engine came alive. It could climb like few others and dive faster than any aircraft in the Allied arsenal. Kartveli's gamble began to pay off, but few outside the factory walls could see it yet. The Thunderbolt remained a misunderstood creature, powerful, yes, but still mocked for its bulk. To many pilots, it felt unnatural to fly something so heavy into battle. Yet every bolt, every curve of its metal skin carried the mark of a purpose: to survive, to protect, and to strike back with unmatched fury. The Republic engineers weren't building for style. They were building for the future, a future where air war would demand more than speed. It would demand machines that could endure endless missions, carry devastating weapons, and outlast the enemy through sheer will and strength. That philosophy, born in the minds of Kartveli's team, would soon rewrite the rules of aerial warfare and turn this mechanical underdog into one of the most feared aircraft ever to take flight. While pilots across Europe were busy mocking the Thunderbolt's size, something far more serious was happening across the Atlantic. In the roaring factories of America, an industrial war was being fought, a war of production, precision, and perseverance. The P-47 was not just a machine of aluminum and rivets. It was the embodiment of American industrial might, built in the fires of assembly lines that never slept. Republic Aviation's plants became hives of activity, filled with the thunder of hammering metal, the hiss of welding torches, and the rhythm of machinery working day and night. Thousands of men and women labored shoulder to shoulder, turning raw materials into the powerful warbird that would soon dominate the skies. For every pilot who doubted the Thunderbolt, there were countless factory workers who believed in it. Women in headscarves and overalls handled the same steel that would soon shield pilots from enemy fire. Mechanics, machinists, and engineers poured their skill into creating a fighter that didn't just fly, it endured. Assembly lines stretched endlessly, each P-47 taking shape from a pile of parts to a roaring symbol of resistance. Even in its incomplete form, it looked unlike anything else: broad wings, deep fuselage, and that unmistakable round nose housing its mighty double wasp engine. Outside, trains and trucks rolled in with a constant stream of materials: aluminum sheets, engines, ammunition, and fuel tanks. America's factories became the real front lines, where production speed meant survival and precision meant victory. While soldiers fought on the beaches and in the trenches, workers back home fought their own battles with wrenches and welding guns. Every rivet they drove, every engine they tuned was an act of defiance against tyranny. And among all the aircraft rolling out of the assembly lines, none carried the same sense of raw, unapologetic power as the Thunderbolt. At first, the demand was overwhelming. Republic Aviation had to expand rapidly, training new workers, building new facilities, and coordinating with hundreds of subcontractors. Mistakes happened, deadlines loomed, and pressure built with every telegram from the front demanding more planes. Yet somehow, despite the chaos, the factories delivered. The Thunderbolt began to roll out in numbers that astonished even its critics. Each one represented not just technology, but unity, the combined effort of an entire nation that had transformed its economy into a war machine. As these steel giants emerged from factory doors, Test pilots took them to the skies above New York and Long Island, where the sound of their engines echoed like thunder. For the first time, witnesses began to understand the scale of what America was creating. These planes weren't delicate instruments of war, they were brute force machines of survival, designed to bring pilots home even when the mission turned to hell. The massive Pratt & Whitney engines roared like living creatures, their deep growl shaking the ground as the planes lifted off. Each takeoff was a promise that the next time this aircraft flew, it would be heading toward enemy lines. This industrial miracle didn't just build planes. It built confidence. America was proving that victory could be manufactured through willpower and determination. The laughter of enemy pilots in Europe was distant, almost meaningless, compared to the deafening rhythm of production back home. Every shift change, every whistle that signaled another completed P-47 was a reminder that the P-I-wee whistle that signaled another completed P-47 was a reminder that the signal mockery overseas wouldn't last forever. The flying milk bottle was becoming an unstoppable storm, and the storm was about to break over Europe. When those first squadrons of Thunderbolts were loaded onto ships and sent across the Atlantic, they carried with them not just firepower, but the heartbeat of an entire nation's labor, courage, and faith in progress. When the first squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts finally arrived in Europe, the mood among Allied pilots was mixed. Many looked at the bulky fighters with skepticism, wondering how these heavy machines could possibly compete against the agile Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that dominated the skies. To pilots used to nimble aircraft like the Spitfire or the P-40, the Thunderbolt felt enormous, unresponsive, and intimidating to fly. On its first missions, it seemed to confirm every doubt. Takeoffs required long runways and landings were rough. The cockpit sat high above the ground, giving the pilot an excellent view, but also a sense that he was sitting atop a tank rather than inside a fighter. Early combat reports described the aircraft as sluggish and fuel-hungry. Yet beneath those early frustrations was potential waiting to be unleashed, potential that few yet understood. The first real test came when Thunderbolt squadrons began escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. German fighters were quick to engage, confident that this new American plane would be easy prey. But the moment the Luftwaffe tried to dive away, something unexpected happened. The Thunderbolt, with its enormous weight and aerodynamics designed for stability, could dive faster than almost anything else in the sky. Pilots reported speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour in steep dives, a terrifying velocity for the time. German aircraft that tried to escape downward often found the P-47 right behind them, spitting fire from its 8.50 caliber machine guns. Still, early missions were far from perfect. The Thunderbolt's limited range kept it from staying with bombers all the way to their deepest targets. Many early escorts had to turn back before the bombing runs began, leaving formations vulnerable. Pilots complained about mechanical issues, oxygen system failures at high altitude, and radio malfunctions that made coordination difficult. Each sortie revealed a new weakness, and engineers scrambled to fix them. But every mission also revealed strengths, unmatched durability, incredible speed in a dive, and a cockpit that protected its pilot even after taking brutal damage. Pilots began to realize that the P-47 might not turn as tightly as a Spitfire, but it could survive hits that would shred other fighters. It was a plane built not for elegance, but for endurance. The turning point came when pilots started adapting their tactics to the Thunderbolt's strengths. Instead of trying to outmaneuver German fighters in close dogfights, they began using boom and zoom attacks, diving from altitude, firing devastating bursts, then climbing back to safety before the enemy could react. The massive power of the R2800 engine gave them the energy to climb higher than most opponents, and once in position, the P-47 became a hawk waiting to strike. Slowly, German pilots began to respect and fear this new intruder. It wasn't beautiful, but it was lethal. Back at Allied bases, mechanics worked tirelessly to keep the planes flying. Crews often spent sleepless nights repairing battle damage, patching bullet holes, and replacing shattered canopies. Every scar on the Thunderbolt's fuselage told a story of survival. The pilots who had once laughed at its bulk now returned from missions alive because of it. One pilot famously said, "You can fly at home with half the plane shot off." The laughter that once surrounded the Thunderbolt began to fade. The German aces who had mocked it were learning that this strange, overbuilt fighter could take a beating, strike hard, and vanish before they could line up a shot. The P-47 had entered combat as a joke, but it was already beginning to earn respect. Not through looks or grace, but through the brutal, undeniable proof of survival. As the war intensified, the Thunderbolt's true nature finally revealed itself. The early doubts faded the first time pilots felt the raw force of those 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns tearing through the air. With one pull of the trigger, the P-47 unleashed a storm of lead, a barrage, so powerful that even a short burst could rip enemy aircraft to shreds. Each wing carried 4 guns, and when they fired in unison, the vibration shook the entire plane. Pilots described the sensation as if flying through thunder. What once looked like a heavy, awkward fighter now became a weapon of terrifying precision. In dogfights, the German pilots who had once laughed realized too late that this flying milk bottle could outdive, outgun, and outlast them. Combat reports began to pour in, filled with stories of Thunderbolts turning the tide of air battles. The P-47s dived from the clouds like falling giants, hammering Luftwaffe formations before climbing back into the sky. When hit, their thick armor shrugged off bullets that would have torn other planes apart. Pilots discovered they could absorb incredible punishment, engine fires, shredded control surfaces, even wings riddled with holes, and still make it home. Some returned with half their tails missing, or holes large enough to crawl through. Yet the engine kept roaring until the wheels hit the runway. This toughness gave Allied pilots a new kind of confidence. They no longer feared combat the way they once did. They trusted their machines to protect them. The German pilots who faced the Thunderbolt quickly learned to respect it. In their reports, they began calling it the flying tank. They had never seen anything so durable, so relentless. Traditional dogfight tactics no longer worked. When they tried to outturn the Thunderbolt, it climbed away. When they dove to escape, it followed. And when they tried to catch it, they found themselves under a rain of bullets. The P-47 could empty thousands of rounds in seconds, slicing through aluminum, engines, and flesh with devastating accuracy. Many Luftwaffe pilots were shot down before they ever saw who hit them, but the P-47 wasn't just lethal in the air. It soon became a nightmare for German troops on the ground. Its 8 heavy guns tore through trains, trucks, and tanks, leaving trails of destruction across Europe. With bombs strapped under its wings and rockets added later in the war, the Thunderbolt evolved into one of the most fearsome ground attack aircraft of the conflict. Pilots strafed enemy convoys, blasted bridges, and turned entire columns of armor into burning wrecks. The Luftwaffe could barely keep up, their fuel supplies shrinking, their best pilots exhausted. Wherever the Thunderbolt appeared, German morale crumbled. In mission after mission, the P-47 proved that its design had been far ahead of its time. Its power dive gave pilots control at incredible speeds. Its radial engine resisted damage, and its rugged frame protected them from the chaos of battle. The laughter that had followed its debut was gone, replaced by silence and dread. The same German pilots who had once mocked it now warned new recruits about the Jug, a machine that appeared out of nowhere, roared like a beast, and left nothing standing. By the time the Allies established air superiority over Europe, the Thunderbolt had earned its place among the greats. It wasn't the most elegant or the fastest, but it didn't need to be. Its purpose was clear: dominate the skies through power, protection, and unrelenting fire. Those 850s became the sound of retribution, the voice of industrial vengeance echoing through the clouds. The joke had ended. The storm had arrived. By 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved from an untested newcomer into one of the most feared and respected aircraft of the entire war. Its massive frame, once seen as a flaw, became its greatest strength. Allied pilots now called it the Jug, with affection rather than mockery, and it earned that nickname by enduring missions that would have destroyed lighter, faster fighters. The Thunderbolt had found its rhythm, not just as a dogfighter, but as the ultimate workhorse of the skies. While other planes specialized in one role, the P-47 could do it all. Escort bombers, dive through flak to strike enemy positions, and protect its pilot through the worst chaos the war could throw at him. The war in Europe was changing. Allied bombers were flying deeper into German territory, hitting industrial targets that powered the Nazi war machine. These raids were long, brutal, and required fighters that could not only fight but survive. The Thunderbolt became the backbone of these escort missions. It might not have had the range of the later P-51 Mustang, but within its reach, it ruled the air. German interceptors, once confident, found themselves outgunned and outmatched. In high-altitude combat, the Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged engine gave it an advantage few could match. It climbed with purpose, dove like a falling hammer, and turned its 8.50 caliber guns into an aerial scythe. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, began to crumble under the relentless pressure. But the true power of the Thunderbolt was revealed at lower altitudes, where it became a terror to anything on the ground. As Allied forces pushed toward occupied France and beyond, the P-47 was fitted with bombs and rockets, transforming it into one of the most effective ground attack aircraft in history. Its toughness allowed it to fly through intense anti-aircraft fire, strike tanks and convoys, and make it home riddled with shrapnel, yet still functional. Pilots learned to dive low, skim over treetops, and unleash their fury on German columns. A single Thunderbolt could turn a train or convoy into a smoldering wreck within seconds. Troops on the ground came to see the P-47 not just as an aircraft, but as a guardian angel roaring overhead. For the men flying it, the Thunderbolt inspired an almost personal loyalty. It wasn't a graceful partner like the Spitfire or Mustang. It was a brute, a protector, a machine that could take hell and give it back twice as hard. Many pilots credited it with saving their lives. They returned to base with stories of missions that seemed impossible, wings shredded, engines coughing, controls nearly frozen, yet somehow, the Jug brought them home. Mechanics marveled at how much damage the aircraft could endure and still fly. Each dent, bullet hole, and burn mark was a badge of survival, proof that the Thunderbolt was more than metal. It was a lifeline. Its reputation grew beyond measure. German pilots began to recognize its silhouette instantly, that broad fuselage and huge propeller marking doom from above. Ground troops feared the sound of its approach, that deep, rhythmic rumble that meant destruction was seconds away. In the air, few dared to engage it head-on. In the field, its roar signaled that Allied dominance was complete. The Thunderbolt didn't win battles through grace or speed. It won through strength, resilience, and an unbreakable will, a perfect reflection of the nation that built it. The machine, once mocked for being too heavy and too strange, had become the very image of unstoppable power. A flying fortress that turned ridicule into victory. As 1944 turned into 1945. The skies over Europe were filled with the roar of Allied engines, and among them, none were louder or more feared than the P-47 Thunderbolt. The plane that had once been dismissed as too big, too heavy, and too clumsy had now become a symbol of dominance. It was everywhere, above the beaches of Normandy, across the fields of France, and deep into German territory. Wherever the Allies advanced, the Thunderbolt was close behind, strafing, bombing, and tearing apart anything that dared to move. It had become the embodiment of overwhelming firepower, an aerial hammer pounding away at the crumbling walls of the Third Reich. German troops on the ground came to dread the sound of the Jug's engine. The distant growl of its massive propeller meant only one thing: destruction was on its way. They had learned that running was useless. The P-47 could appear suddenly from the clouds, guns blazing, unleashing a storm of bullets that shredded armor, ripped through vehicles, and scattered soldiers in every direction. Entire convoys were reduced to twisted metal in seconds. Trains, supply trucks, and tanks became easy prey. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany, could do little to stop it. Their resources were drained, their best pilots gone, and fuel shortages meant many aircraft never even made it off the ground. In the sky, the Thunderbolt ruled uncontested, carving its legend into history with every mission. For Allied pilots, the Thunderbolt became more than a machine. It was a partner, a weapon that inspired total trust. They knew it could take punishment and still bring them home. Pilots returned with tails missing, engines sputtering, or control surfaces shredded, yet somehow the Jug refused to die. It was as if the aircraft had a soul of its own, stubborn, determined, and unbreakable. There were stories of Thunderbolts limping back to base on one wing, landing with holes the size of fists through the fuselage. Each of these tales spread among the squadrons, strengthening their faith in the plane and the engineers who built it. In an age when survival often depended on luck, the Thunderbolt gave its pilots something better: confidence. The P-47's success wasn't just about strength or firepower. It was about how it adapted to the changing war. It could switch from bomber escort to ground attack in a heartbeat, from air superiority missions to close support for advancing troops. When Allied forces pushed into Germany, the Thunderbolt cleared the way, smashing defenses and isolating enemy positions. The sheer volume of ordnance it could carry, bombs, rockets, and machine gun ammo, made it a flying arsenal. No other single-engine fighter could match its versatility. It was as effective at 30,000 feet as it was 30 feet above the ground. That ability to dominate in any role made it indispensable to the Allied war effort. And while the Mustang would later be celebrated for its long-range missions, the Thunderbolt's contribution was no less crucial. It broke the Luftwaffe's back, tore apart German logistics, and made the skies safe for bombers and ground troops alike. By the final months of the war, it was clear that the laughter that had once greeted the Thunderbolt had turned into silence and fear. German pilots who had mocked it now spoke of it with grim respect, and soldiers on the ground whispered about its wrath. The Jug had earned its place among the greatest fighting machines ever built, not through elegance or speed, but through raw endurance and overwhelming firepower. It was a warrior's aircraft, built not to impress, but to survive, destroy, and win. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood as one of the most legendary aircraft of World War II. It had started as a joke and ended as a symbol of victory, a machine that embodied the grit, resilience, and unstoppable determination of the Allied forces. Over 15,000 Thunderbolts had been built, serving across every major theater of the war, from the skies of Europe to the islands of the Pacific. Everywhere it flew, it earned respect, not just from the men who piloted it, but even from those who faced it in battle. The Germans who once laughed at its bulky frame now admitted that the Jug had been one of the most dangerous adversaries they ever encountered. In the final months of the conflict, the Thunderbolt's dominance was complete. It escorted bombers deep into Germany, destroyed thousands of enemy vehicles, and crippled vital supply lines. Its pilots racked up staggering kill counts both in the air and on the ground. The numbers told the story clearly. The Thunderbolt had proven itself beyond all expectations. It wasn't sleek or graceful like the Mustang or Spitfire, but it didn't need to be. It was built for survival and power, and in those brutal years of war, that was exactly what victory required. Even after the war ended, the Thunderbolt's legacy continued to grow. Many nations adopted it into their air forces, using it for years in new conflicts and post-war missions. Its design had proven so rugged and adaptable that it easily transitioned into the jet age's early years. Engineers who worked on the P-47 often said it taught them lessons that shaped the future of American aviation, lessons about reliability, versatility, and the balance between power and protection. The massive Pratt & Whitney R280 engine that powered it became one of the most celebrated piston engines ever built, later finding its way into other iconic aircraft. For the men who flew the P-47, the bond they shared with their aircraft never faded. Decades after the war, they spoke of it not just as a weapon, but as a companion that had carried them through hell and brought them home. Many veterans described climbing into the cockpit as stepping into armor, knowing that whatever awaited them in the skies, their Jug would fight beside them until the end. Some even credited the aircraft with saving their lives multiple times, surviving damage that would have destroyed any other plane. The Thunderbolt had earned their love the hard way, through fire, metal, and survival. In the grand story of aviation, the P-47 remains a masterpiece of brute force engineering, a plane that defied expectations and redefined what a fighter could be. It proved that air superiority isn't only about speed or elegance. Sometimes it's about endurance, firepower, and the will to keep fighting when everything else fails. Its 8.50 caliber guns became the signature of Allied air power, the sound of justice roaring through the skies. Today, when people see the Thunderbolt at air shows or in museums, they see more than a relic. They see a legend, a machine that started as a laughingstock and ended as a hero. The same German pilots who once mocked it learned to fear its thunder. Its heavy frame, its roaring engine, its relentless spirit, all of it combined into one unforgettable legacy. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but it didn't need to be. It was powerful, loyal, and unstoppable. It proved that sometimes strength is its own kind of beauty. And when the skies were dark and the world was on fire, it was that kind of beauty that helped bring freedom back to the earth.